In 1983, Sidney Moncrief became the first Defensive Player of the Year in NBA history. One season later, he won it again. The award had been created to identify the league's best defender, and for its first 2 years, basketball produced the same answer: a 6'4" guard from Milwaukee who made every possession feel personal. Michael Jordan described the experience plainly. "When you play against Moncrief," he said, "you're in for a night of all-around basketball. He'll hound you everywhere you go, both ends of the court. You just expect it." Larry Bird offered a similar verdict, praising the way Moncrief followed every defensive responsibility without shortcuts and repeated the work every night. The strange part is how little that reputation explains by itself. Moncrief was not a specialist surviving on defense. He became a 5-time All-Star, earned 5 All-NBA selections, and led Milwaukee through one of the most consistently successful stretches in franchise history. In 1983, his Bucks swept Bird's Celtics from the playoffs. That leaves the question at the center of his story. How does a man Jordan expected to hound him, Bird respected without qualification, and the NBA chose as its first great defensive standard, become almost invisible beside the other guards of his era? Moncrief never reached the finals. Milwaukee's best years unfolded outside the brightest national spotlight. Then degenerative damage in both knees turned a complete two-way guard into a player counting how much movement remained. The decline can be read directly in the numbers, but the cost was human. Moncrief's game depended on chasing the best scorer at one end and carrying an offensive load at the other. His tragedy was not a scandal or a talent wasted through indifference. It was that he accepted every difficult assignment, did almost everything a franchise could ask, and still watched his body take away the movement that made it possible. Before the All-Star selections, the awards, and the physical decline, there was a boy in Little Rock, Arkansas, and a college program almost nobody expected to become nationally important. That is where Sidney Moncrief first learned to make relentless work look ordinary. He was born on the 21st of September, 1957, in Little Rock, Arkansas, not Los Angeles, not Boston, not New York. A southern city, a modest start, about as far from the bright lights as a future star could begin. The rivals who would one day define his era were shining in the biggest markets in the country. Sidney Moncrief came up somewhere else entirely. That is the first clue to understanding the man. The relentlessness, the refusal to coast, and the way he treated defense as a personal responsibility all belonged to someone who understood early that nothing would be handed to him. Little Rock did not place him near the machinery that manufactured basketball celebrities. If Sidney Moncrief wanted recognition, he would have to earn it possession by possession, then return the next night and earn it again. He attended Hall High School in Little Rock, and you can already see the outline of the player he would become. Years later, talking about the burden of guarding the league's best night after night, he would put it in his own simple, honest words. "I just took it as a responsibility as much as it was a challenge," he said. "That was something I needed to do to help the team win games. I'd rather just chill on defense and get back on offense, but I didn't have that luxury." That phrase, that he didn't have the luxury, tells you everything about where he came from. When he arrived, the basketball world he was about to enter was not a powerhouse. The University of Arkansas program at the time was defined by modest success and a whole lot of disinterest. Nobody was circling Fayetteville on a calendar. Nobody expected a turnaround. But when Sidney Moncrief showed up in 1975, he wasn't arriving alone. He was about to become one-third of a trio that would shake college basketball straight down to its foundations. They called them the triplets: Sidney Moncrief, Marvin Delph, and Ron Brewer. 3 young men who, together with head coach Eddie Sutton and his assistant Gene Keady, took a dormant, forgotten program and dragged it kicking and screaming into the national spotlight. The rarity of it is easy to miss. One transcendent player can change the fortunes of a school. 3 arriving together, complementing one another, and defining an era is almost unheard of. What they built lasted beyond a couple of good seasons. They laid the foundation for a program that grew into one of the country's premier college basketball powers and kept rolling through the late 1990s. But this wasn't about reputation, it was about results, and the results were dominant. The triplets led Arkansas to the Southwest Conference regular season championship in 1977, again in 1978, and again in 1979. 3 straight. On top of that, they captured the conference tournament title in 1977 and once more in 1979. So how does a no-name program suddenly start steamrolling everybody in sight? The answer was the culture Sutton built and the players who bought into it completely. Moncrief was the engine, the two-way force who set the tone. By the time he was done, he was the school's all-time leading scorer, a record that would stand until Todd Day finally broke it in 1992, but 3 regular season banners meant nothing without the right stage. Conference titles get you respect, they don't get you immortality. In 1978, that bigger stage finally arrived, the Final Four, and it would end in a way that left the program haunted by one of the most painful words in all of sports: what if? In 1978, Arkansas did the unthinkable. The triplets carried the Razorbacks all the way to the national semifinals, the Final Four, one of just 4 teams left standing in the entire country. For a program that had been an afterthought only a few years earlier, it was a staggering achievement. And then came the heartbreak. Arkansas ran into Kentucky, and Kentucky was on a mission. The Wildcats would go on to win the national championship that year, and they ended the Razorbacks' run in the semifinals. So close to the summit, and yet stopped just short. If you're paying attention, you can already feel the pattern forming. Falling just short of the biggest prize would, in time, become the defining theme of Sidney Moncrief's entire basketball life. There's a strange historical footnote attached to that run, too. After the loss to Kentucky, Arkansas beat Notre Dame in the 3rd-place game in what proved to be the last consolation game ever played at the NCAA Final Four. A small piece of history tucked into the corner of his college story, the final example of a tradition the sport would soon leave behind. The following year, in 1979, they came back hungry and pushed deep into the tournament again, all the way to the Elite Eight. And this time, the team that ended their season carried a name that would follow Moncrief for the rest of his career. They fell to Larry Bird and Indiana State. That was the first seed of a rivalry, the first collision between Moncrief and Bird, 2 men who would spend years circling each other in the professional ranks. By the time he walked away from Arkansas, Moncrief held the school's scoring record and became the first player in the program's history to have his number retired. A legend in Fayetteville. But while he was wrapping up his college legacy, a far stranger drama was quietly unfolding 1,600 miles away inside the front office of the Los Angeles Lakers. By the time Sidney Moncrief left school, he was the all-time leading scorer in Arkansas history, a mark that survived until 1992. He was a consensus first-team All-American in 1979 and the Southwest Conference Player of the Year that same season. His number 32 was lifted to the rafters, the first jersey retired in program history. He had done everything a college player could do. So when the 1979 NBA draft arrived, he was a coveted prospect. The Milwaukee Bucks selected him 5th overall, the pick that would shape the rest of his life. But here is where the story takes a turn that almost nobody remembers, a near miss so dramatic it could have rewritten the entire decade. Because Jerry West, the legendary figure running the Los Angeles Lakers, reportedly wanted Sidney Moncrief. According to an account from a journalist who covered the team, published years later in a book excerpt by the writer Jeff Pearlman, West made his desire crystal clear to Lakers owner Jack Kent Cooke. As that account put it, there was a strong belief, for a brief time at least, that Moncrief, not Magic, would wind up a Laker. The Lakers held the 1st overall pick in 1979. They used it on Magic Johnson, and that decision launched one of the greatest dynasties the sport has ever seen. Showtime, championship after championship, under the brightest lights in basketball. If the wind had blown only slightly differently, Sidney Moncrief might have worn that purple and gold instead. No comparison can tell us what he would have become there, but the contrast followed both careers. This is a second-hand account from someone close to the situation, not a direct statement from West, so it belongs in the story as a credible possibility rather than settled fact. Still, it hangs over Moncrief's career like a ghost. Magic received Los Angeles, Showtime, and 5 championships. Moncrief went 5th to Milwaukee, where a colder city and a demanding team were about to discover exactly what they had in him. Because in Milwaukee, the boy from Hall High School was about to become Sir Sid. So there he was, a young man from Little Rock dropped into Wisconsin among cold winters, blue-collar fans, and a franchise that worked hard and asked no favors. It was the opposite of the glamour that purple and gold promised out west. Milwaukee did not swallow his legacy. The city understood him, embraced him, and eventually raised his number to the rafters. The problem was that the rest of basketball too often looked past the city, and therefore past the man carrying it. He would spend 10 full seasons there, from 1979 all the way to 1989. A decade, an entire prime given to one city. And in that decade, the boy from Hall High School became something else entirely. The fans gave him names, the way fans do when a player becomes part of the fabric of a place. They called him Sid the Squid. They called him El Cid. And the one that stuck the deepest, the one that captured the dignity and the relentlessness all at once, was Sir Sid. That kind of affection is unusual for a defensive player. Defense earns respect, but rarely the warmth reserved for scorers and highlight makers. Moncrief was something rarer, a stopper with personality, a grinder Milwaukee fans genuinely adored, and a man whose work on the unglamorous end of the floor created 2 reputations at once. Rivals feared the assignment. His city cherished the worker accepting it. He joined a team that was becoming serious. These were Don Nelson's Bucks, a group with no patience for excuses that won and kept winning. The obstacle was brutally specific. Philadelphia had Julius Erving and later Moses Malone. Boston had Larry Bird. Detroit was waiting at the far end of the decade. Milwaukee was not chasing an abstract curse. It was trying to survive a conference crowded with teams history would remember as champions. By the time the 1980-81 season arrived, the Bucks had become a 60-win machine. They were no longer pretenders. They were genuine contenders. And yet, that very season would deliver a single Game 7 loss, so bitter, contested for more than 2 hours by a head coach who simply refused to accept it, that it would expose just how cruel this era was about to become. The 1980-81 season was the moment Milwaukee announced itself. 60 wins against 22 losses. The 3rd best record in the entire league. This was no longer a team hoping to be taken seriously. This was a team that had arrived. And Sidney Moncrief was right in the middle of it, contributing 14 points, just over 5 rebounds, and better than 3 assists a game, doing a little bit of everything for a club that suddenly looked like it could go toe-to-toe with anybody. 60 wins. In any era, that's a benchmark of greatness. It's the kind of regular season that's supposed to lead somewhere. And so the Bucks marched into the playoffs carrying real belief, only to run straight into Philadelphia in the conference semifinals. What followed was a war. 7 games, back and forth, 2 teams refusing to give an inch. And it all came down to a single, agonizing Game 7 decided by 1 point, 99-98. Philadelphia survived. Milwaukee did not. But here's the part that tells you everything about how much it stung. Don Nelson, the Bucks head coach, would not let it go. He contested that 1-point loss for 2 hours and 16 minutes. 2 hours and 16 minutes, long after the final buzzer, arguing his case, demanding answers. His complaint centered on whether Philadelphia had gotten away with a 24-second shot clock violation in the dying moments of the game. He believed his team had been robbed of a possession, and with it, a season. Now you can read that protest 2 ways. You can see a coach who lost his composure, Or you can see a man who understood in real time exactly how thin the margin was between this franchise and the breakthrough it was chasing. That single point, that single disputed possession, that was the difference between moving on and going home. This is where the pattern becomes undeniable. The Sixers, the Celtics, and later the Pistons kept appearing at the decisive moment. Milwaukee could win 60 games, execute for 6 months, and still have its season reduced to one disputed possession against Philadelphia. Being excellent was not the problem. The Bucks kept discovering that, in this Eastern Conference, excellence was merely the price of entry. If anyone doubted whether Moncrief could carry a team when it mattered most, the 1983 postseason was coming. It would deliver an answer so loud that not even Larry Bird could argue with it. Before we get to that spring, let's freeze a single night in time, because it captures something about Sidney Moncrief that the highlight reels of history tend to forget. The 24th of February, 1983, Milwaukee against the Houston Rockets. And on that night, the man known as a defensive specialist poured in 42 points, the highest scoring game of his entire career. 42 points, 8 assists, and 8 rebounds in a 114-103 victory. 42, 8, and 8. That is not the stat line of a one-dimensional stopper. It belongs to a complete basketball player who could take over a game on the end of the floor his defensive reputation had pushed into the background. And that's the thing people get wrong about him. The reputation, the awards, the testimony of rivals, all of it leaned so heavily on his defense that it buried the other half of his game. But the truth is that Sidney Moncrief averaged more than 20 points a game in 4 separate seasons of his career. 4. He wasn't just a guy who locked up the other team's best scorer and then disappeared on offense. He was a genuine two-way force, the rarest kind of player there is, the kind who hurts you no matter which way you turn. This was the period when he climbed into the league's elite. The all-star selections accumulated, the recognition came, and the team rose with him. Across the entire decade of the 1980s, Milwaukee posted the league's 3rd best winning percentage. Only the Lakers and Celtics finished ahead. The Showtime dynasty, the Bird dynasty, and then the Bucks, quietly piling up wins in the cold with Sir Sid as their engine. That's the company he kept. Not the company history remembers him keeping, but the company the record actually shows. 2 of the greatest franchises of all time, and then the Bucks, nipping at their heels for 10 straight years. And that spring, in the 1983 playoffs, Moncrief would do something that no Bucks fan who saw it would ever forget. He would take the great Larry Bird and the Boston Celtics, and he would sweep them clean off the floor. Larry Bird's Celtics were not the kind of team you swept. They were the standard. They were the measuring stick of the entire Eastern Conference. And in the second round of the 1983 playoffs, Sidney Moncrief and the Milwaukee Bucks did the unthinkable. They swept them, 4 games to none. Gone. Moncrief did not merely survive that series. He averaged 23.2 points, 6.5 rebounds, and 4 assists against the best team Boston could put on the floor. Larry Bird, who would praise Moncrief for doing everything right on defense without taking shortcuts, watched his season end against that same man. If anyone needed proof that Sidney Moncrief could carry a playoff offense while accepting the hardest defensive work, it was there in black and white against a legend. For a moment, the finals seemed close enough to touch. Sweep the Celtics, and surely this had to be the year. Philadelphia was waiting. The Bucks advanced to the Eastern Conference Finals, and there stood Philadelphia, the same Philadelphia that had haunted them 2 years earlier. This time, the Sixers were a juggernaut, and they handled Milwaukee 4 games to 1. Sidney Moncrief, at the absolute height of his powers, fresh off humbling Larry Bird, was stopped 1 step short of the finals once more. But here is the detail that says everything about how good that Bucks team really was. Philadelphia went on to win the championship that year, rolling through the entire postseason. And in all of those playoffs, against every team they faced, the only club that managed to beat them even once was Milwaukee. 1 single postseason loss for the eventual champions, and it came from Moncrief's Bucks. They were, by that measure, the second-best team in basketball. And second best in that era meant you watched somebody else lift the trophy. This was the cruel rhythm of his career. Reach the peak, prove yourself against the greatest names alive, and still watch another team advance. Yet even as the finals slipped away, the league was preparing to hand Sidney Moncrief an honor that had never existed before, an award created for exactly the kind of player he was. In 1983, the National Basketball Association introduced a new award. For the first time in its history, the league decided to formally recognize the best defensive player in the game, the man who did the dirty work, the one who won games on the end of the floor that never made the morning highlights. They called it the Defensive Player of the Year. And the very first man to ever win it was Sidney Moncrief. He was not one winner in a line stretching back decades. He was the first, the original standard against which every defensive guard who followed could be measured. When the league finally decided to honor defense, it looked across the NBA at every stopper and grinder, and chose the man from Little Rock. Then, just to remove any doubt, he did it again. In 1984, Sidney Moncrief won the Defensive Player of the Year award a second straight time. The first two trophies in the history of that honor, both sitting in Milwaukee, both belonging to Sir Sid. That is not a fluke. That is not a single hot season catching the voters' attention. That is back-to-back recognition as the finest defender alive, 2 years running at the dawn of an entirely new way of measuring greatness. And it fit him perfectly, because defense for Moncrief was never an afterthought. It was a calling. Remember his own words about guarding the league's best night after night. He said he took it as a responsibility as much as a challenge, that it was simply what he needed to do to help his team win. He admitted he'd have rather rested on defense and saved his legs for scoring, but he said plainly that he didn't have that luxury. So he did the hard thing instead. Every night, and the league built an award that he then claimed as his own, twice. This was the foundation of his reputation, the thing that would echo through the testimony of the greatest players of his generation. Because the men who had to face him understood something the box score could never fully capture. And in time, two of the biggest names the sport has ever produced would put that understanding into words that still carry weight today. When you want to know how good a defender really was, you don't look at the man himself. You look at the faces of the people he guarded. You listen to what they say years later when there's nothing left to prove and no reason to flatter. And in Sidney Moncrief's case, the witnesses are about as credible as it gets. Start with Michael Jordan, the most lethal scorer the game would ever produce, a man who treated double teams like minor inconveniences, once sat down with a reporter from the Los Angeles Times and described what it was like to face Moncrief. His words were not casual. "When you play against Moncrief," Jordan said, "you're in for a night of all-around basketball. He'll hound you everywhere you go, both ends of the court. You just expect it." That phrase, "you just expect it," is the tell. Jordan wasn't describing a tough matchup. He was describing an inevitability, a thing you braced for before the game even started. Then there's Larry Bird, who watched his Celtics get swept by this man and still spoke about him with something close to reverence. Bird once put it as plainly as he ever put anything. Moncrief, he said, does everything you're supposed to do on defense and doesn't take any shortcuts, plus he does it every night. And there it is. Two words that hold the whole story inside them. Every night. Bird wasn't just praising the technique, he was praising the consistency, the refusal to take a possession off, the willingness to do the exhausting thing again and again with no rest. That, more than any single steal or block, was what made Sir Sid feared across the entire league. Jordan expected Moncrief to hound him. Bird treated him as a defensive standard. The testimony establishes his greatness, but it also reveals the physical bill attached to it. Every night meant another low stance, another chase through screens, another collision, then another trip to the offensive end where Milwaukee still needed him to score. That bill was already coming due inside both knees. Every night came with a price. The quality Bird admired, that relentless and unbroken effort, required Moncrief to spend his career in a defensive crouch, changing direction with another star and absorbing contact before Milwaukee asked him to attack at the other end. By 1986, the damage would no longer stay hidden. The cruelty was precise. A player whose identity rested on relentless movement, chasing the best scorers from baseline to baseline and then becoming a scorer himself, depended on his legs more than almost anyone on the floor. The first slide, the recovery step, the burst into the lane, and the lift through contact all began below the waist. That is exactly where Sidney Moncrief began to break. He was carrying a degenerative condition affecting the cartilage in both knees. Not one knee, both. Cartilage is the cushion that lets a joint absorb the pounding of a professional athlete's life. As it deteriorates, the movements do not disappear all at once. Each cut, stop, and burst simply costs more than it did before. Beginning in 1986, recurring trouble in his foot and heel also began taking games from him. Moncrief could still understand every angle on the floor. His body was becoming less willing to reach them. The 1986 postseason made the problem visible. In the Eastern Conference semifinal against Philadelphia, Moncrief's body allowed him onto the floor for only 3 games. Milwaukee was trying to survive a 7-game series while its most complete player moved in and out of availability. The heel and knees were no longer private discomfort. They were helping decide which version of the Bucks could appear. Yet the Bucks won all 3 games he played. The most telling came in Game 7 at home, a 113-112 victory in which Moncrief scored 23 points. 1 point separated the teams, and there he was, physically compromised but still decisive. That contrast was becoming his new reality, unavailable for most of the series, indispensable whenever his body permitted him to enter it. That was the tragedy taking shape. It was not a sudden collapse with one unmistakable ending. Moncrief could still produce a performance that changed a playoff series, which made every absence harder to accept. The team needed him, the instincts remained, and the legs increasingly controlled whether Milwaukee could reach the player still present in his mind. For one more spring, though, the old Sidney Moncrief would flicker back to life. And almost nobody watching would realize it was the last time the basketball world would ever see him whole. The 1987 playoffs offered one final extended look at something close to the complete Sidney Moncrief. Calling him fully healthy would go beyond what the record can prove, especially after a regular season limited to 39 games. But for that postseason stretch, the old production returned. The line between the prime version and the diminished one was already blurred. This was the last time the fuller version stayed visible on the biggest stage, and he showed up beautifully. In that postseason, Moncrief averaged 20.9 points and 4.4 rebounds a game, 20 and 4 in the playoffs from a man whose knees were already compromised and whose feet had already begun to fail him. For a few weeks, the cushion held, the body cooperated, and the scorer, the defender, the two-way force that Jordan dreaded and Bird admired, was all there again, intact and dangerous. There is something almost unbearable about a player moving through his last great postseason without the ceremony that usually tells us to pay attention. No farewell tour, no tribute, no announcement that this was the final extended glimpse of the old Sir Sid. His body held together just long enough for the scorer, defender, and leader to occupy the same uniform again before they began separating for good. What makes that spring so haunting in hindsight is how closely it bordered collapse. During the same 1986-87 campaign, Moncrief had appeared in only 39 regular season games. The body that gave him those 20-point playoff nights had already kept him out through much of the winter. The peak and the cliff were sitting next to each other on the calendar. And once that spring ended, the numbers did something brutal. They fell off a cliff. And the stat table that records what happened next tells the story more coldly and more honestly than any words ever could. To understand what happened next, the stat table is enough. Its numbers descend like a staircase Moncrief could not stop, and each step records not a loss of knowledge or effort, but a shrinking supply of healthy nights. Start at the top, where he lived for half a decade. From the 1981 to 82 season through 1985 to 86, this was a man who played 79, 80 games a year and averaged better than 20 points a night. That's not just productive. That's Ironman durability married to genuine stardom. Show up almost every game, carry the scoring load, guard the best player on the other team, and do it for 5 straight years. Then comes the fall, and it is steep. In 1986 to 87, he played just 39 games and averaged 11.8 points. Cut the games in half, cut the scoring nearly in half. In one offseason, the foundation simply gave way. The next year, 1987 to 88, he managed 56 games at 10.8 points. A slight bump in availability, but the scoring kept sinking. Then 1988 to 89, 62 games at 12.1 points. And here is the line that closes the case. After that collapse began, Sidney Moncrief never again averaged more than 12.1 points a game. Never again. The 20-point scorer was gone, and he was gone for good. This was more abrupt than ordinary aging, which usually presents as a gradual slope and a half-step lost over years. Moncrief went from 5 seasons of near-nightly availability and 20-point scoring to 39 games and 11.8 points. The cartilage in both knees and recurring foot trouble were separating the player he understood himself to be from the minutes his body could supply. Bird's 2-word compliment now carried its full psychological weight. Every night. Reliability had been part of Moncrief's identity, the quality rivals respected before they discussed any technique. Now the player known for refusing to take a possession off could not reliably take the floor. The mind still prepared for responsibility. The schedule kept producing nights on which the body could not accept it. Milwaukee was still winning, and the East remained unforgiving. But the complete two-way player the Bucks needed in those postseason matchups was disappearing season by season, not because his commitment changed, but because movement had become a limited resource. By the spring of 1989, Sidney Moncrief had run out of road. The body that had carried him to 2 Defensive Player of the Year trophies, to 5 All-Star nights, to 42-point games and playoff masterpieces against Larry Bird had finally worn down past the point of return. And so, at the close of that season's postseason, he walked away for the first time. The ending carried one final cruelty because of who delivered it. Milwaukee lost in the Eastern Conference semifinals to Detroit, which went on to win the championship. Philadelphia had beaten the Bucks by 1 point in 1981 and ended their run again in 1983. Boston dominated much of the conference, even though Moncrief once swept Bird aside. Now the Pistons were sending him into retirement on their way to a title. His decade can be traced through opponents that became champions immediately before, during, or after stopping Milwaukee. That is the quiet heartbreak at the center of his prime. Milwaukee won and kept winning, compiling the league's third-best record across the 1980s behind only Los Angeles and Boston. There were 60-win seasons and a sweep of Bird Celtics, but no finals. Magic received championships and showtime. Isaiah Thomas would receive rings in Detroit. Jordan would become a global mythology. Moncrief received Milwaukee's loyalty, damaged knees, and a resume without the final stage that turns excellence into legend for casual fans. There was no scandal, no collapse of character, and nothing tabloid about the way it ended. Sidney Moncrief did not destroy his gift. That is what makes the story hurt. He worked, defended, scored, led, and stayed with one franchise through 10 demanding seasons. The conference was merciless, and his body failed before the breakthrough arrived. He had done nearly everything right and still lacked the one image history rewards most, himself standing on the final stage. And so, in 1989, it appeared to be over. The man they called Sir Sid had played his last game. The relentless engine finally stilled. The Milwaukee chapter closed after 10 long years. Except it wasn't over. Not quite. Because after a full year away from the game, An itch he couldn't ignore would pull Sidney Moncrief back onto an NBA floor one final time in a different uniform, in a different city, for one last flickering glimpse of the player he used to be. For an entire season, Sidney Moncrief stayed away. The 1989-90 campaign passed without him on a roster, the first full year of his adult life spent outside the NBA calendar. No training camp leading into October, no scouting report waiting in the locker room, no nightly assignment against the best guard in another uniform. At 33, with his knees worn thin, he had to discover what remained when the responsibility that organized his life was gone. But something pulled him back. Whether it was the itch every great competitor feels, or simply the refusal to let the injuries write the final sentence, Moncrief signed with the Atlanta Hawks for the 1990-91 season. A new uniform, a new city, one more run. Nobody expected much, and for most of that year, nobody got much. The two-time defensive honoree, the man who once dropped 42 on Houston, was now a role player late in a long career, his minutes managed, his body carefully rationed. And then, on the 2nd of May, 1991, the old Sir Sid flickered back to life one final time. It came in a playoff game, Game 4. And the opponent, of all the teams in basketball, was the Detroit Pistons, the same dynasty that had ended his Milwaukee run 2 years earlier. In just 22 minutes on the floor, Moncrief poured in 23 points. 23 points in 22 minutes against the most physical team of the era, from a man whose legs had supposedly betrayed him for good. The Hawks won that night, even though they would ultimately lose the series. The symmetry was almost too neat. Detroit had ended his Milwaukee prime on its way to a championship. Now, at the very end, against that same dynasty, his damaged body offered one last gift: 23 points in 22 minutes. A flash bright enough to remind everyone that the player had not forgotten how to dominate. He had simply lost reliable access to the body that once carried out the instructions. When the final buzzer of that 1991 playoff run sounded, Moncrief retired for good. But instead of chasing the spotlight, he did something almost no superstar ever does. He went home. A man with the league's first 2 Defensive Player of the Year trophies, a player the Lakers reportedly coveted and Michael Jordan expected to hound him, did not linger in a glamorous city or reinvent himself as a celebrity. When the game was finished with him, he returned to Arkansas, the same ground where the whole story had started. Upon his first retirement in 1989, Moncrief opened Sidney Moncrief's Buick in Sherwood, Arkansas, and later owned a Ford dealership in Blytheville. The scoreboard changed. Instead of points, minutes, and matchups, there were employees, inventory, customers, and the daily demands of a business carrying his own name. For a retired star accustomed to being measured every night, the ordinariness was not an anticlimax. It was proof that usefulness could continue after applause. That ordinariness matters because this story is partly defined by what did not happen. There was no public unraveling to keep his name circulating after retirement, no scandal feeding television retrospectives, and no spectacular fall for later generations to rediscover. The man Jerry West reportedly wanted was quietly building a steady life where his roots ran deepest. His second act carried the same trait Bird admired on the court, a refusal to take shortcuts, even when the work attracted no cameras. In 1990, he also put his own story down on paper, publishing a memoir titled Moncrief, My Journey to the NBA, co-written with Myra McClary. It reads almost like an act of self-preservation, a man recording his journey in his own words at the very moment the wider basketball world was beginning to overlook it. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that his peak had happened far from the cameras, and that memories like his have a way of fading if nobody writes them down. But Sidney Moncrief wasn't finished with basketball, not by a long shot. His second life in the game would carry him from a college sideline all the way to the bench of the very franchise that had defined him. The pull of the game never really let go. In 1999, Moncrief took the head coaching job at the University of Arkansas Little Rock, a chance to teach the sport in his own backyard. It did not go the way he must have hoped. That season ended with a record of 4 wins and 24 losses, a brutal line for a man who had known so much winning as a player. Coaching, he was learning, is its own merciless trade, and the brilliance that defined him on the court did not automatically transfer to the clipboard. But he kept at it, moving through the levels of the profession with the same persistence he'd always shown. He coached the Fort Worth Flyers in the NBA's Developmental League in 2006. He served as a shooting coach for the Golden State Warriors in 2007 and 2008. He even traveled overseas, working as an assistant with the Beijing Ducks in 2009, a wandering basketball education far from the marquee. And then came the part of the journey that felt like destiny circling back on itself. From 2011 through 2013, Sidney Moncrief returned to Milwaukee as an assistant coach with the Bucks. The city that had defined him, the place where Sir Sid had been born, pulled him home one more time. Then, in July of 2013, it was announced that he would analyze and commentate on Bucks games for the regional broadcast. The voice in the booth talking through the franchise he had once carried. Behind all of it was the family man that the relentless competitor's reputation tended to hide. Moncrief is a father of 4 sons. One of them, Brett, carried the athletic bloodline forward on a different field, playing football as a wide receiver at Mississippi Gulf Coast Community College and later at Troy University. The man who guarded the best scorers alive every single night had built something quieter and more lasting away from the arena. For decades, though, the recognition lagged stubbornly behind the resume. Until at last, in 2019, basketball's highest honor finally called his name. In 2019, the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame finally called Sidney Moncrief. Decades after his peak and after injuries had taken the back half of his prime, the sport's highest validation arrived as a correction. He had no finals footage replayed every spring, no championship pose, and no scandal keeping him culturally present. The Hall forced the record back into view. The first 2 defensive trophies, 5 All-Star selections, 5 All-NBA teams, and a decade of winning that deserved more than a fading memory. The honors closer to home had come sooner. Milwaukee had retired his number 4 back in 1990, then rededicated that jersey at halftime on the 19th of January 2008, a reminder to a new generation of fans of who had once worn it. And by certain measures, his career offensive efficiency ranks among the very highest in the history of the franchise. A quiet statistical footnote that confirms what the eye test always suggested. He was never just a stopper, he was a complete player, hiding in a defender's reputation. Years later, with the noise of his career behind him, Moncrief offered a reflection that lands differently once the whole story is visible. "When you retire and you have time to reflect upon your career," he said, "I started to have a greater appreciation for what I was able to accomplish." There is no bitterness in those words and no complaint about the rings that never came or the body that failed too soon. There is simply a man learning to see the size of a career that history had compressed into the word defense. The Hall of Fame did not create Sidney Moncrief's legacy. It corrected the delay in recognizing it. He was the defender Larry Bird respected, the opponent Michael Jordan expected to hound him, and the engine of a Milwaukee team that kept winning without reaching the final stage. His tragedy was not that he threw greatness away. It was that he gave the game everything his body could supply, then disappeared from the loudest version of history because there was no ring, no scandal, and no easy myth. The trophies, banners, and testimony remain. Sir Sid was the league's first answer to the question of its best defender and one of the finest two-way guards of his generation.